Okay. I just want to just welcome everybody a good morning in Washington, and then to those who are joining, good afternoon for those who are joining on the European side. My name is Jonathan Katz. I am a fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund, and also the executive director of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. GMF is partnering with Free Russia Foundation today, and we want to thank them for their collaboration and bringing together and pulling together this important discussion. I think we all know that over the last 2 weeks, it's been an earthquake in terms of what's taking place in Ukraine, the ongoing military conflict that's taking place, but it has also shaken both European security architecture, and then looking ahead is impacted global issues, including global economics. The impact of the current situation has also impacted greatly what's happening internally in Russia. And so today's conversation with Free Russia Foundation and GMF is really a conversation to focus on the internal situation in Russia, the impacts of the current war that's taken place, and of course, the speakers who are joining us today, and we'll just do a brief introduction of all three of them, have been vocal in their opposition to the current conflict that's taking place, and have long sought to seek political changes internally in Russia in terms of democracy and human rights. And many of them, all three of them, too, have spoken to the challenges posed by Mr. Putin, because they've also been directly targeted, along with their colleagues, their friends. And so what's taking place right now internally in Russia, where we see an increased crackdown on any type of opposition to the current war, closure of media, independent media, draconian new sentences, criminal sentences for anybody who speaks out. And yet still, we see images coming from Russia of many brave Russians who are willing to come out into the street despite knowing the consequences of their actions, to seek a change in the current policy of the Kremlin and Mr. Putin. And so the conversation today is looking at what's taking place internally. Obviously, we see numbers of Russians also leaving Russia as well, with the understanding of concerns about the current policies, the direction of the country, and of course there's the internal impact too over the last 2 weeks, maybe hard to see right now, of economic policies as well, and how that impacts Russians internally. So there's a lot to unpack today in this conversation, and which is we'll have an opportunity for Q&A as well, and the Q&A function after we turn to our three speakers. And again, and I'll cue that up when we get to that point. But I'm going to just turn to, and we have Natalia Arno, Dmitry Gudkov, Vladimir Milov. Natalia is the president of Free Russia Foundation, and have worked with closely for a number of years here, has been a real advocate for both democracy and human rights and change in Russia, and is well known in her organization, both in Washington, Europe, and globally. And I'm going to turn to her first. Dmitry Gudkov and Vladimir Milov both have been in both opposition politicians, leading voices for political change, and have been on the front line of those efforts for quite some time. And for those that are joining, know them quite well. And so I'm not going to go into their full bios for this conversation, but what I did want to do is start off with Natalia, because I wanted to bring you into this. And I just want to start by saying too, the Russian voices are critical right now, to hear from Russian voices, and there's such a strong desire to communicate from the West, to better understand what's happening, but to communicate directly to Russians internally about what's taking place in Ukraine, and to explain what's taking place, but to urge, an end to the current military campaign. But I started off by talking about, some of the challenges that Russians are now facing. This isn't new for many Russians who have been, and like yourself and others that have been involved in addressing democracy deficits, corruption, which is something that names like Mr. Navalny and others have exposed, that the West is now looking at, where you guys were, many pushed and said, hey, address these types of economic erosion and corruption before. And I just wanted to bring, Natalia, you in to maybe tell us a little bit first about what you're seeing internally and the changes that have taken place. And then we'll go to Vladimir and then to Dimitri. And I just want to make one plea before I promise this will be my last point. There is a concern about how the treatment of Russians outside of Russia. And I want to make it perfectly clear that's unacceptable to target. It's so important to not place blame on those that have left Russia, who in many ways are the ones leaving because of repression internally. And I think when we look over the long term about the work that you've done and others have done, is to support a democratic transformation that you have all sought, the type of transformation that changes the outward perspective of a government in Russia and a future Russia that is very much part of a partnership in a much different way than what we see today. So Natalia, if I could just turn to you, I offered a mouthful of many different things that I think we're all observing, but I want to turn it over to you and Vladimir and then Dimitri to kind of pick up on this. And you're all so vocal and out in social media, but and elsewhere speaking to these issues now. And I thank you so much for taking a little bit of time to join us today for this conversation. So Natalia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for understanding how important Russian voices are in this evolving tragedy. And we thank GMF for our continued cooperation. I'll let our prominent politicians, Vladimir and Dmitry, to talk more about the situation inside Russia and also about mass exodus, but let me just tell you a few things. On February 24th, Putin unleashed this full-scale war against Ukraine, and many of us hoped that this military build-up, one of many, was just a bluff. Unfortunately, the worst nightmare is happening. And it's probably not even the worst of the worst scenarios, because Putin keeps threatening with nuclear strikes. And now it's hard to count on his bluffs. But the good news is that the expiration date of Putin's regime has rapidly expedited. And probably this problem of 2024 is not a problem any longer. For years, we've been asking to recognize Putin's regime legitimate. There were never free and fair elections in Russia. There was this constitutional coup in 2020, if anybody remembers it now. Putin's never complied with any international agreements. And the list of crimes that Putin regime did even before February 24 was long enough to recognize this regime legitimate back then. But after February 24, even the term regime change is not radical any longer. Attacking Ukraine, Putin made a suicidal mistake, but he also destroyed Russia with that. We also should always remember that Putin occupied Russia first before he started to attack its neighbors, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and now, and conduct all this malign activity in the West. And while it was surprising to see this full-scale operation, at the same time, we, of course, should remember how he came to power by blowing up apartment buildings. And like in pre-war times, we still have two Russias. Putin's Russia, with his now more and more scared elites, and pro-Putin population, brainwashed by 24/7 zombifying propaganda, and quite mobilized at the moment, I should say. And we have Russia of normal people. All these years we were saying to the West, to all our partners, friends, that please don't equate Russia and Putin's Russia. Of course, it's much more difficult to say it now. But we also should say that the war changed also the proportions between these two Russias, and maybe also we see a more drastic difference between them. So the split is huge. But we anti-war, anti-Putin, pro-democracy Russians, for us, it's now this the most traumatizing and agonizing experience. We have always supported Ukrainian people and their European choice of freedom and democracy and independence. We are very well informed, and we feel personal responsibility for human tragedy unraveling as Russian military is shelling civilians. The cost of active civil position inside Russia for pro-democracy Russians has gone up to the ultimate level, their freedom and their life. Many Russians now cannot continue living and working inside Russia. And now the law enforcement in Russia is even equipped with more tools, this expanded state treason law, foreign agents law, and many, many others. So it's now what we see is a huge war cost exodus from Russia. It's hundreds of thousands, and the number is growing as we speak. In Georgia alone, Minister of Economy in his interview mentioned that just in 6 days, 25,000 Russians entered Georgia. So what we see now is basically the emergency evacuation of massive proportions. So this war is not only Putin's war against Ukraine. We understand that this is the war between the dictatorship and the democratic world. And it's also very, very important to mention that many pro-democracy Russians are very active in this battle. Just my team alone, we evacuated the team first, but then we started to evacuate people from Ukraine. We actually the only organization evacuating, still keep evacuating people from Kiev. Simultaneously, we have to evacuate people from Russia as well. Just like several days ago, the caravan that we evacuated consisted of 3 buses with 3 cars behind each bus and a minivan with 10 dogs from the shelter. But this was quite an unusual one. Usually it's just 2 or 3 buses from Kiev, but on a daily basis. We do fundraising. We were able to fundraise enough for a shelter for Ukrainian refugees families in Moldova. We push for sanctions. We push for more military and humanitarian assistance, for no-fly zone. But we also understand that a very important mission on us now is to have this information campaign so that pro-democracy exiled Russians can target in-country Russians, because now, especially now when all independent media basically shut down, and also all the social media are censored and blocked, and so it's very difficult. It's more and more people-to-people connections at the moment. Plus, all these 70,000 Kremlin bots and trolls that are now deprived of their platforms in the West, they are now focused on in-country population and target and continue brainwashing. While we all are very impressed with the heroic leadership of President Zelensky and courage and bravery of every Ukrainian, I don't know if it's a legend, but when even an old lady can destroy a Russian drone with a jar of pickles, we at the same time should remember all those heroic Russians that continue speaking out, continue going to the streets despite all these repressions and legislations and everything else. Since the beginning of the war, the protests were in at least 115 Russian cities, and more than 14,000 people are detained. They are all our heroes as well. We should remember about them. So what our biggest ask would be is to please don't equate pro-democracy Russians and Putin's Russia. Continue engaging all of us into these efforts, especially in the efforts of information campaigning, but not only, because again, all of us are completely, as everybody else, shocked, outraged, angry, ashamed, and we also understand our collective responsibility that we should stop the war at any cost at the moment. And many of us can do many things. we can engage many people as psychologists and lawyers and like everybody else, like just do this, back to this fight. If you know anybody in Russia, if you work with people in Russia, and if you see that people are not afraid, let them know that you see them, that you see those efforts. It's very, very important for us, for Russians. Plus, in all these policies and all the sanctions, especially those who are inside the country, keep asking us, please don't forget about us. And many of these actions is actually a friendly fire. All this high-tech depriving this monetization of YouTube, for example, or just other things, they cannot talk to Russian people. And it's very important to help them to do that. So ultimately, supporting victory in Ukraine is the biggest support to the Russian society. I'll probably stop here. I'll engage more in Q&A session.
Natalia, thank you. You walked through so much, including the numbers of people who are leaving, but also how you mentioned sort of, you know, anti-Putin, anti-war, pro-democracy, which I think is so important, but the work that you guys are doing also to engage and support Ukrainians is really important. But one thing, and I'm going to turn to Vladimir, because I want to give you the really hard question of that building on what Natalia said about sort of the internal situation, and sort of, we can't help but ask, as even we're looking, sort of how this is impacting some of the politics internally in Russia from your perspective is, and Natalia said that this is going to have an impact. We know you've talked about fraudulent elections. I mean, you're right. There hasn't been a free and fair, transparent election in Russia during Mr. Putin's reign. I have to go maybe pretty far back to find that period. But maybe, Vladimir, because I know you're a great student, as well as Dimitri, of what's happening internally. Maybe speak a little bit at how this has maybe impacted politics internally. But then I want to get your thoughts too, because Natalia raised the issue of communications, and I think with Russians. And so how do you do it? What do you think? And I'll ask Dimitri, I'll ask you this too. How should the sort of the West engage? How should the United States or Europe be engaging with Russians? I mean, President Biden has been very clear that this is not what the U.S. is doing in the West is not. It's supposed to be targeted at President Putin and those around him to make it painful for what's being taking place, to hold them responsible. But we know sanctions also is not a silver bullet, and also concerns about how it could impact Russians internally as well, that are not the part of this effort as well. So I just want to turn it over to you. But the internal stuff is something that I think a lot of people are also thinking about. And Natalia, you opened it up by saying you think that this will dramatically impact what politics looks like in the future. And I just wanted to get your thought, because I know both you and Dimitri are also students of what's taking place in Russia, in Moscow right now. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for having this timely conversation and a very important focus on the Russian society, which can be an important ally in what Natalia correctly described. This is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between autocratic world and the free world. And this is not about Ukraine. Putin, I don't think that he will win in Ukraine, but if he does, imagine that he will definitely not stop with Ukraine. I think it's pretty much clear now for everyone who is watching. So it's important not to eject Russians out of our view of the free world. It's important to treat Russians as allies. I will briefly run through some bullet points. First, as a former bureaucrat, I communicate a lot with many of my friends and acquaintances who still work there in the system at different levels. And I have to say that they are absolutely devastated and terrified about what's going on, which means that very soon, in a few weeks' time, maybe we'll see severe cracks in the structural integrity of Putin's system. because for many people, technocrats who've been simply doing their jobs on various regulatory levels, the loyalty is gone. One important thing is that, Putin maintained this notion that, yeah, we might have some shortcomings in the social and economic policy, but they're quoting some monarch from 19th century that Russia is a military power in the first place. So there's one thing at least where Putin is proficient, is maintaining the military power so we can conquer lands, and show everybody something. Now we see that collapsing by the minute. Because Russian army is performing so poorly in Ukraine, it is so disorganized and incapable to fight, that this puts under question, the whole notion of aggressive geopolitical standing. Now, if we cannot win in Ukraine, then what's Putin up to, threatening America, NATO, European Union, big international powers, and so on? We're doomed to lose in this fight. That's the sentiment that is growing among Russian nomenclatura, which is very important. Another thing is that nobody actually expected such severe sanctions that were imposed on Russia. The belief was also, I assume, on part of Putin and his closest colleagues, that at least we have the financial reserves, the rainy day fund, which will help us weather through these difficult times. Now, most of it is currently blocked with the central bank being sanctioned by G7 countries, so we're not able to use these reserves. And the financial and economic bloc of the Russian government is totally incapable of handling this current situation. They in the panic, they went as far like complete prohibition of purchasing the foreign currency for Russian citizens. No, it's even worse than late 80s and perestroika years. So we already have shortages of basic food in stores. We'll have inflation reaching at least several dozen percentage points year on year, and there will be many effects in a few weeks to come. The system is simply not prepared to handle that many effects, negative effects at the same time. We'll eventually, I don't want to make like rosy predictions about collapse, but definitely Putin will face the most severe test of the credibility of his system, internal, domestic test, as soon as in a few weeks to come. Another thing is that this white noise about conflict in Ukraine, potential confrontation with the West, have been going on for quite a while on Russian propaganda TV. So people were pretty relaxed about it, and the society was completely unprepared for that kind of consequences that we got to be facing right now. So public opinion-wise, we haven't yet felt it because the lag time is significant to see the public opinion trends. But from what we know, like my colleagues from Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation did a very good polling in Moscow, which shows very significant daily shifts in public opinion, shifts obviously in a very negative way for Putin. I'd also recommend, that I can send everybody a study published by a group of pollsters who did this usual polling in the regional level, headed by the Qualitas Opinion Polling Center, which I'd say these are really hardworking professionals. And it's the best what we got now, because you don't trust Seom or FOM anymore, that's propaganda. So I have to say the bad news is that the public support for Putin's military incursion is significant. But the good news is that the opposition is also quite notable, and the support of Putin's war is not predominant. It's in the range of 40-50 percentage points, and only on condition that it is what Russian propaganda calls a special military operation. I would dare say majority of the Russian population still thinks that we are doing some limited peacekeeping operation in Donbass. There are clear trends in public opinion which shows that the support for what Putin is doing is fading as soon as people are realizing that this is like a full-scale, all-out war, not a limited-scale military operation. This is very reminiscent of what we had in the 80s with the Afghan war. And I remember, because I was a school kid, but I was a politicized and pretty much interested school kid. So I remember that in early 80s, people generally bought the idea that it's only a limited operation, limited military presence in Afghanistan. By 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, there was already a very significant negativity in the society because of the body count, because of the economic consequences, isolation, and so on. Because of internet and social media, that trend is taking place on a much faster pace right now in Russia. So we see our mission not as I try to sort of restrain from emotions and simply focusing on talking to the Russian people and spreading the message through. Now, with new waves of censorship, I think, speaking about repressions in Russia, I think the most severe thing which we are experiencing now is absolutely new levels of censorship and trying to completely shut off the undesired information, the truth, by the Russian government. However, what we encourage people to do is for all the several millions of our permanent audience, we call them to become the main agents of distributing the truth. We say it's not only our job to broadcast, it's your job to take the arguments, to take the news that we're sharing and go to talk to people door to door every day. Like I say in my broadcasts, I receive messages from my viewers who say to me, I have convinced one person today or two persons today that what Putin is doing is wrong. So that's the way to go. Everybody, all these several millions of people who watch us, they should go and try to convince one, two, three persons every day, every week. And I think this word of mouth is exceptionally important in this regard. And I also wanted to touch upon what Natalia said correctly about friendly fire. Now, listen, I understand that in the environment of a total war that Putin have waged, it's hard to expect a precision calibration of sanctions and measures. Some of the sanctions will definitely affect ordinary people. But I also suggest that we establish a task force in Washington, in Brussels, in European capitals, which should study the ways to minimize the effects of financial sanctions, technological sanctions on ordinary Russians who are effectively engaged in combating Putin, in waging a counter-propaganda war, in helping Ukrainians fight for their freedom. That's important because now it was clear that Visa and MasterCard would be shut down, but it affected predominantly people who are outside Russia. Many of them starch Putin's opponents, quite significantly engaged in opposition efforts. Some of the technological sanctions and withdrawal of some technology companies really hurts accessibility of the internet for ordinary Russians. And we have an independent Society for Internet Freedom, which issued a statement about this today that, like, you should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. So now, again, I completely understand. We're in total war. We should expect that some of the sanctions are not too calibrated and might also hit some of the friendly folks. But what I suggest is that we establish a task force, or whatever you call it, which should try to study how these effects are producing some, negative consequences for Russians who are fighting against Putin, to try to minimize all these effects, to try to help Russians, open the second front against him. Which, to conclude, I have to say, for which there is a very good situation domestically, because everything will be deteriorating, structural integrity of Putin's system will be failing. That is a very good time for us to jump in with our counter-propaganda and truth-spreading efforts, which means that these efforts should be doubled down, and some obstacles, including newly arisen obstacles, should be removed if possible. But again, I think that we'll have, in the coming months, weeks, we'll have certain successes in turning public opinion around. So it's important that the West bears that in mind and does not view all Russians as enemies. Many of the Russians are allies of the democratic world. We are working to actually remove this veil of propaganda and make the majority of them allies to turn against Putin. I think that's fairly possible to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think your suggestion on a task force is really important. Carve out including things for humanitarian needs like medicines or other things that might be caught up in this, along with sort of technology-related restrictions that may impact the ability to communicate. And I'm going to come back to you too, just on, because I know you spent a lot of time on targeting, and I'll do that after this, targeting, where the money is, and task force have been set up, including in the United States already, with the Department of Justice to actually prosecute and go after this money. And I think it's particularly important to maybe get a sense. I will ask you, where do you think some of the gaps are on the sanction side, particularly those that are in this inner circle, or those that have within, or that are close to Mr. Putin. Dmitry, if I can bring you in, you just heard Vladimir speak to what's happening internally, and sort of maybe some of what could happen even over the next couple of weeks as things start to impact internal issues, including the military campaign that is is really, with horrific images, including yesterday in Mariupol, that hospital. From Vladimir, what you were saying too, I mean, it's hard for us to know whether or not Russians can see this. I know probably within certain lines of communication that this is not Mariupol, and a hospital is not, it's outside of the Donbass. It's clearly targeting civilians. These are really gripping, and these images are horrific. But I wanted to ask you too, because earlier today there was a meeting with Mr. Lavrov and Ukrainian foreign minister, and hearing Vladimir and Natalia speak about what's happening internally, there's some thinking or some commentary to suggest that perhaps Mr. Putin wants to find an off-ramp, that the language is shifting, and terminology such as denazification, which is really, ironic. Obviously Mr. Zelensky is Jewish. I mean, to me, it sounds like a code word for atrocities that we heard during World War II with the Nazi regime. So it's quite startling to people to see that, or the symbolic use of Z, with the images of black shirted young people, saluting. It's really quite jarring. But I wanted to ask you about, maybe speak to this question of whether or not what Vladimir said, which based on sort of like this unexpected sort of unity, the sanctions, level of sanctions. I would say the Biden administration and allies and partners have been in lockstep on this in a way that, I think even maybe some thought even here in Washington might not have been possible in response. But clearly it's a level of response that's quite significant. I want to maybe just speak to what Vladimir said, and I just want to ask if you think that there, that we might be seeing some willingness to negotiate, or is that just more smoke and mirrors, and sort of sort of bent on sort of total control over Ukraine and a scorched earth strategy that we're seeing. So it's a big question to ask you, but I think people are trying to figure out this nuance, and then maybe speak to what you view as what was just raised too, which is what should engagement look like? And I thought, Vladimir, your idea on sort of both one, like sort of separating, and sort of understanding where Russians stand, the differences, the nuances, but finding ways to keep that lines of communication open, even under these difficult circumstances, so important. So Dimitri, can I just send it over to you to maybe pick up from where Vladimir left off? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Natalia, and thanks to all participants for this discussion. It's very important for us. I absolutely agree with Vladimir. It's not the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's the war between Putin and the free world. And I can say that if Putin succeeds, so he will continue to create problems for other countries, for the European Union. And of course, I absolutely agree that Russian elites are terrified and experience a shock, and nobody expected such a severe sanctions against Russia. But I think that nobody expected Putin would start this so-called special operation, because even 2 weeks ago, I remember Natalia just called me and told me like to leave in Kiev, and I answered, "Oh, I don't believe in any war." And all experts consider Putin to be bluffing, just to blackmail Western elites, to negotiate, and to achieve like lifting sanctions and so on. But I would like to raise three issues and three problems. The first, it's a problem of so-called unpopular refugees. And after Putin invaded in Ukraine, more than 2 million people fled Ukraine and became refugees. And the European Union passed emergency laws allowing Ukrainian residents to obtain refugee status and work permits automatically. And this is an unprecedented side of support for Ukrainians who have left the country. However, hundreds of thousands of Russians refugees are also fleeing our country, unfortunately. And of course, they are not running from bombing, but they definitely, most of them, definitely stand against this war, against Putin. And now they are forced to hide their passports and documents, feeling ashamed of their nationality. And unfortunately, they are not as welcome in other countries. And then they don't have visa-free entry into the European Union. They are not issued tourist visas and can now get a work permit and even open a bank account. So I can't open a bank account in Cyprus. I can't get residency in Cyprus. So it's a serious problem. And it's happening with all Russians and even Ukrainians in Cyprus. So it's still a serious problem. And many educated and talented people, entrepreneurs, so turned out to be blocked because we are residents, unfortunately, residents of an aggressor country. And these people flee now to country with no visa requirements for Russians, such as Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Serbia, and other countries. And as Natalia mentioned, more than 25,000 of Russians fled to Georgia. And I hear a lot of stories, and every day I hear every day this story that for most of Russian refugees, it's a double jeopardy. They are punished by Putin's government, which banned transfers outside of Russia, and also by the international payment systems, which have made the cards useless pieces of plastic, and people have families, children, no health insurance abroad. And again, of course, it doesn't look as scary as the tragedy of the Ukrainian refugees, but it's also the end of the world for these people. And it's 20 or 25% of Russians, not Putin's silent majority, who watched Netflix, dressed in Zara, bought furniture in IKEA, and traveled abroad. And so I think that we need to save these people. We need to help them. We need to support. And of course, all of these people want change in Russia. Many are fleeing persecution inside Russia because of the law punishing for telling the truth about the war. And they're facing a jail time. And there is only one choice, like exile or jail. There is no other option for them. Just I understand that the tragedy of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are sharper, of course, and more pressing. But I think the West, the United States, and the European Union should not forget about these unpopular refugees. And so maybe we need to like create some opportunities to obtain refugee status, and this opportunities should be also open to Russian refugees. And many of them are in serious and in dangerous situation if they return to Russia. You know, according to new law, telling the truth may cost you a court sentence up to 15 years of jail. That's why they're fleeing. The second problem is like social media requirement sanctions. You know, Google and Yandex and other social networks suspended all ad sales in Russia, and it has seriously hit especially independent journalists and bloggers spreading the truth about the war. It's a serious problem because we have a strong propaganda. All independent media have been blocked. The Facebook and Twitter were blocked, and we're expecting the same with YouTube. So when after these restrictions, the audience of independent journalists and bloggers has decreased, and now there is only one channel for Russian people to get information. And you know, Russian propaganda paints absolutely different picture. They tell people about so-called special operation against Nazis, and about Russian army like trying to save Ukrainians from Nazis. And when people are asked whether they support Putin or not, so they don't support the war. They support this special operation. They support this fake like news. And if they find out sometimes, if they get proper information, I think that they will change their mind, especially when they feel the results of the sanctions. I think that they will feel within weeks or maybe months. So, and I hope that the public opinion will be changed. So, and third problem, it's the problem. It's bank restrictions, you know, and Vladimir can tell you about the problem with the nations, because I know that Navalny's team and Navalny's anti-corruption foundation got 30% of donations from Russians, and now it's impossible to donate money from here to Russia and to get donations from Russians to the work for our social media, for our channels, for our journalists and bloggers, and for this fight against Putin. So we have a lot of problems with this, and maybe we can find a way how to protect these unpopular refugees and help us with like to lift these restrictions, or maybe we need to maybe Natalia, maybe that's possible to get authority for a Free Russia Foundation to approve lists of refugees or something like this, and to help them with the legalization in the Western countries. So. But at the same time, I think that there is a possibility to have a split of elite, of Russian elites, because I think that just a few people were informed about plans of Putin to invade in Ukraine. When I was in Cyprus a month ago, I met here a lot of members of Russian parliament, and they told me that, Dmitry, don't worry, Putin will not going. It's a bluff. So it's a bluff, and Putin has to realize that it can be a political suicide for him and for Russian economy that will be definitely destroyed by this severe sanctions. And now they, I know that they feel terrified because they have a lot of properties and assets abroad, and their children study, work in the European Union and the United States, and this war can strip them of all opportunities in their lives. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, no, thank you for sort of raising those two issues in terms of, I think, Vladimir, you were talking when he was speaking before about some sort of a task force or group set up to kind of look at some of the actions that may be more negative than helpful in terms of addressing these issues, and certainly on the refugee issue or people leaving. It's important to understand what the numbers are, where people are going, but also to raise this issue, because I think when you have 2 million refugees, Ukrainians that have already left, it certainly will, it's not going to be, it's not certainly in the media as much what's taking place. And I think it's important to lay out what's taking place. There are also Belarusians also fleeing from Lukashenko in Belarus as well, which is another problem. So I think these are all really important issues to raise. I want to just turn quickly because there's a number of questions. One, and I'll turn to Natalia too, Vladimir, if you want to answer this too. The title of the event today was focused on the potential for martial law, and sort of what, obviously it looks like when you looking in from outside at what's happening, it sure seems like, that is maybe a logical step potentially by Mr. Putin and the Kremlin if you want to crack down on any dissent regarding what's taking place in opposition to the conflict or to policies that people have concerns about or oppose. I wanted to ask you, Natalia, maybe starting with you, what would it mean? What would it look like under martial law, or are we like sort of de facto already there? But it's just not called that because the language even internally may be quite problematic for Mr. Putin with the Russian people. What would it look like?
Well, I'll probably ask Vladimir to answer this more thoroughly, but already what is happening, it's already basically martial law. It's already, there are already so many repressive legislation in place that you can be in jail for absolutely anything. Even before the war, you could be in jail for 5 or 4 years just for a simple tweet or like or something. And of course, any protest activity is completely banned, even single pickets and everything else. So the situation is already terrible. It's going to, of course, only to worsen. We see that the entire war movement is growing. And there will be less, the more Russians learn about the truth about the war, which we all need to put together all our efforts and keep telling the truth, keep just again reaching average Russians about this, the less support Putin's regime will have. They already have the lowest historic lows of their approval ratings, both President Putin and United Russia for many years and so on. So the situation will only be worse for Russians in general. Of course, my main thing is that this is time for us, pro-democracy Russians, to engage and to target Russians inside the country. We will be probably more trusted than any other means of communications, and there are less and less means of communications, and it's up to us again. Without us, it will be much more difficult and much longer to stop the war. Plus, I think we are the best allies. We are the first victims of Putin's regime. We know how it operates very well. We are the best allies of Ukrainians or any other nations of the democratic world. And plus, it will be us who will be rebuilding Russia from its ashes, from its ruins, which Putin created, and the disgraces it caused. So again, it's a huge role of pro-democracy Russians, and I really urge everybody to support us, to help us, and just remember about us. Thank you.
Vladimir.
Yeah, if I may, first, I completely agree that we already have effectively something which can be called martial law. What is martial law? Martial law is largely suspending all the legislation and transfer to official rule by decree. This is what we have for a long, long time now. And I think the only real difference that it would make is mass mobilization, military mobilization in the country. We are not there yet. And I also will have to say that people who are now out of active military service and mercenary units, they are not really capable and prepared for combat. So this will achieve little goal for Putin. In this regard, I don't think that this move will be particularly terribly effective. In terms of ruling by decree, you see that whenever they need new pieces of legislation, however draconian it might seem, they very quickly propel it through a fully controlled parliament. So if they want to like nationalize assets, they will do it quickly without martial law. If they will introduce total censorship, abolish elections, they can do it without martial law. Formal martial law, I think, will have a very negative impact for Putin in PR terms, because he wants to make it look like, you know, a lightweight effort, like a small victorious war. Now, introduction of a full-scale martial law across the country would mean that this plan has failed, and we are now in a total war against some mighty enemy. He doesn't want that, which is why in some of his recent remarks, I think at the meeting with stewardesses, or was it just a lonely teapot out there in the room? He actually said that exactly, I don't feel any, he directly addressed that and said, I don't feel any real preconditions for introducing martial law, because I think he understands the negative effect in PR terms.
Dimitri, did you want to respond as well? I want to give you an opportunity.
I absolutely agree. I think that there is nothing to add. So we have been living in under this martial law since maybe 2012 or maybe 2011. Now it seems to be, it turned out to be tougher because you can get jailed for absolutely nothing, and you can get 10 or even 15 years of jail. So maybe a few years ago it was like 2, 3, 4 years of jail. Today it's 10 and more. So that's the difference. But of course, all people taken to the streets understand risks, and that's why I absolutely agree with Natalia, who said that they are real heroes, people who take these risks, who go to the streets, who participate in the protest actions. They are real heroes. And now it's really, really complicated to be the person to participate in the protest against Putin in this time. So I think that people taken to the streets are very brave people.
No, absolutely, and you know, there are already a number of political prisoners in place before this, and I you know, prominent, you know, names people may not know, but clearly there are going to be more, and it's something that, you know, hopefully, you know, remains at the top of the agenda when we talk about human rights and what's taking place. Vladimir, I can't help but ask you, sort of going back to the question I was talking about earlier about. There was a meeting between Mr. Lavrov and the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Kuleba, today. There is some thinking here, and just sort of that perhaps all the things that you mentioned, which things aren't going that well for Mr. Putin, both economically at home, but also Ukraine's resistance, military resistance, and you know, they haven't gone well. There's a question I'd ask all you two, if you know, obviously there's, you know, people being killed. You know, I view them, many of them, as we heard stories about conscripts not really knowing that they were going to go in. I don't know if these stories are true or not, because it's hard to see within the some of the social media what's real and what's not all the time. But I did want to ask you if you felt like there's been, some people believe, a shift in language coming from the Kremlin. and I think sort of important too, because I think it directly relates to the conversation we're having today. But wanted to ask you if you felt like you've seen any shift, if that's real or not, or do you think that the plan remains the same for Mr. Putin?
Yeah, if I may. First, I do not see any real policy shifts. What I hear, and this is sort of evidence that is coming from talks between Putin and international leaders and their feedback, that is coming from actual meetings that took place in Minsk, negotiations between Russians and Ukrainians, and currently today from Antalya, a meeting between Kuleba and Lavrov. What I hear is that Putin is really not backing down from his initial demands. He wants Ukrainian moratorium on joining NATO. He wants regime change in Ukraine. He wants a puppet government. He wants full Ukrainian recognition of Crimea and Donbass under Russian jurisdiction. So, which I don't really see backing off. What I think about all these negotiation efforts is that this is a sort of a fact-finding mission on Putin's side on whether Ukrainians, which were really hurt badly during these first 2 weeks of invasion, whether they are actually willing to make some concessions for the war to end. I treat these talks as nothing more than that, as Putin attempts to find out, has a position of Ukrainians somehow shifted, so maybe we build on that. Now, what I hear from various sources is that Putin's personal view hasn't shifted a bit. Because he didn't yet feel all these negative consequences that are to come in the next few weeks. His system of governance experienced very serious cracks in integrity, public opinion shifting away from him, basics, food and consumer goods disappearing from stores, hyperinflation. We haven't yet experienced all of that. Before that, I don't really believe in shifts in his position. He believes that he can reassemble some of the remaining most combat-ready troops and try another assault on Kyiv, that he still has enough troops to continue the fight, that Ukrainian military gets exhausted so he can try one more push. I don't see any sign of shifts on his part, which means we need to increase and double down on pressure on all fronts. Today, Josep Borrell said something like European Union had sort of exhausted EU options of sanctioning Russia. No, not that fast. There are hundreds of potential new options which will deliver even more trouble for Putin. We also need to double down on our efforts to talking to ordinary Russians to convince them that it's wrong to either support Putin or to abstain. So we need to increase pressure, because I just don't see any real shifts with Putin's position just yet.
Well, and I think that's really important, because I think there's an effort to try to read these tea leaves. And one of the questions we got in sort of the Q&A, and I think we're going to go to final comments, give each one of you a minute to respond. But one of the comments was, does Mr. Putin really realize what these consequences are? Does he, or the people around him, just sort of feeding him the things that he wants to hear versus what the reality is? And you know, and which I think is an important question. But let's do this, because I want to. You have all been very generous with your time. I wish we could be on for much longer to unpack these. We have a number of questions that we're probably unfortunately not going to get to, so I apologize. Some of them are quite specific, but anybody can follow up with us and we can try to get answers to these questions. Dimitri, can we start with you, just your final thoughts, just sort of message. One of the things too that's come up in a number of the questions in the chat box is about what messages are getting, it's hard to get messages through, which you guys have all pointed out how, particularly on the internet, that there's been a sort of like the channels or means to get communication through is incredibly difficult. But what do you think matters when you or others are speaking with Russians? What are the, I mean, obviously there's some that have been sort of aware of what's happening for quite some time, but what do you think would matter with, particularly even with those that are maybe, the Russians who are not the Putin crowd, but are the ones that are outside of that space? What would matter to them now? And maybe and I welcome any final thoughts you have, and you've got 1 minute.
It's a very difficult question, but I think that it's better to focus on Russian elites, because people, ordinary people, or like pro-European-minded people who stay in Russia, they are intimidated, and unfortunately, they feel that the peaceful protest doesn't work. And I think that maybe it's better to make more like severe and tough sanctions against relatives of the Putin's elites and representatives of Putin elites, because so we know a lot of like children, wives, and so relatives of Russian authorities who live in the European countries, in the United States, and they feel free, staying in the countries. So I think that the West can be more tough with these people, and it's better to differentiate like authorities' family from so-called unpopular refugees. It's better to support people who were forced to flee Russia to other countries, and it's better to to focus on sanctions against relatives of Putin's elites. For example, I don't know what happened with the daughter of Peskov, the secretary of Vladimir Putin. Does she still live in France? I don't know. So we need to check. Maybe it's better to deport these people from Europe back to Russia, to Kadyrov, to FSB, to like angry people who's going to be more angry after they feel sanctions and consequences of sanctions. So the problem that Putin, why there is no serious shift in negotiation? Because I don't think that Putin really feels the consequences of these sanctions, because he lives in his virtual world created by propaganda, and nobody can tell him the truth about what's going on in Ukraine. As I already said, the propaganda paints like good picture, like Russian army is winning, and so we have a lot of problems with Nazis, and so I think that Putin doesn't feel that he's losing this game. So we need to push his inner circle, and maybe we need to push 10,000 of families, which is considered to be like Russian elites. And I think that the personal sanctions against families, relatives, will really hit Russian elites and can lead to the split. That's what we need, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. Vladimir, just for your final thoughts too, and I take your point and Dimitri's point too. I don't think from the U.S. side anybody believes that sanctions have been exhausted yet. That's not the messaging that I hear, and I think that it will be very difficult or near impossible, even in the near term, to even remove these sanctions. Because also the focus on anti-corruption that you guys have exposed to, that there's no going back, and so this is a major example of the push against anti-corruption, not only just in sort of facing both, coming from Russia, but also globally, the enablers of this money, including in the United States and elsewhere. There's been a significant shift. And I think this is pushing this issue over in an overdrive in a direction that won't end. So Vladimir, I'll give you 1 minute just to respond and maybe final thoughts.
Yeah, three things. First, I think Putin, he's not completely isolated from information. I think he understands that he has a problem, but he also thinks that he has sufficient reserves to just make one more try, just one final push and finally achieve it, take Kyiv, and at least give Russians something. So I think this is also a call for doubling down on our efforts to stop him, which means that the second thing is, yes, we need to prepare many new rounds of sanctions, many new rounds. And essentially, I mean, I'll be glad to help, but there are hundreds and thousands of options, pretty painful. We need to sort of tell him the clear formula. Every 24 hours, you don't stop the war, we issue more packages of sanctions. Next 24 hours, you don't stop the war, we issue more. And that will be very, very painful. Because one thing, Russians really are expecting that after several rounds, this will be exhausted. So we need to show them, like, no, every day of continuation of the war will bring you more trouble. And I want to finish with a third thing. Natalia had mentioned a very important issue. Sooner or later, this nightmare will end. And we will have to rebuild all this stuff from scratch. Rebuild Ukraine, rebuild Russia, rebuild Europe. So what I suggest, apart from my task force suggestion, let's think about creating a future Free Russia fund, an internationally administered fund, which can claim all these frozen assets, stolen assets of oligarchs, the property, the assets of central bank, whatever, right? Because we will need them later to pay compensation and damages for Ukraine, which is destroyed right now in front of our eyes. And also to make important reforms in the future Russia. So let's link these two issues, frozen assets and potential capital for a future reconstruction fund for both Ukraine and Russia. I think that will be a good idea, which will be supported internationally.
Yeah, I think very good last point. And sometimes we're so caught up in the moment, we never plan for the future and what's needed. So I think that's a very good idea. And you know, I look forward to following up with you on these good ideas, Vladimir. Natalia, I'm going to give the floor back to you. And maybe just sort of bringing it back to, you know, sort of what, you know, just what we started with about, you know, sort of focusing on the internal challenges, you know, what you think the United States, partners in Europe and others should be doing in terms of engagement. Maybe just your final thoughts, so we can, Vladimir gave and Dimitri gave some very good ideas as things that we should focus on: sanctions, new processes to look at some challenges in terms of how those sanctions might actually be more restrictive and less helpful, but also thinking about the future. But thinking about now, when you hear about the numbers of people leaving, the needs, the importance of keeping the communication with civil society, free media, you've been in the thick of this. Maybe just your final thoughts on how we can best do that.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Well, we all knew from history that all dictatorships eventually fall, all dictators are mortal. We didn't know how and when this brutal dictatorship of Putin will collapse, but I think now we pretty much know how and when. Even before the war, and now it's even more urgent when we keep asking for this. Please remember that, and don't equate between Putin's Russia and free Russia, pro-democracy Russia. We are the ones, we were not only were the first victims of Putin's regime, we were the first ones to alert about danger of Putin domestically and globally, and exposing his crimes, everything else he's doing. And we have probably the best expertise how to reach Russian people and again, grow this anti-war movement. We will be the ones to rebuild Russia when this dictatorship falls. And I really admire Ukrainians who understand this. They actually engage us to, like, really in awe how humanistic they are and how they engage us in all their activities and all their plannings and all this, how to develop all these messages. We always are invited to their rallies to stop the war and do a lot of things together. So we don't differentiate between us. We are this, again, pro-democracy forces all together, and solidarity is our biggest weapon against dictatorships. So this is what we should continue.
Good point to end on. And again, we're a little bit over time. Thank you so much for staying over time. This won't be the only discussion that we're having on this subject, and we thank all of our speakers for joining us. We'll share the video too for those that maybe came halfway through, didn't see the beginning, and pick up on some of these ideas, good ideas that came out of the conversation, but also how important it is to to think very hard about what's taking place internally in Russia. What you call, has been in place for a while, a martial law-like system, and try to find a way forward that looks ahead in a much more positive way in the middle of a crisis, which is sometimes very hard to do. So thank you for being here and for your words. And I heard what you said too very clearly about how you are engaging with Ukrainians as well, the offer of support, and looking ahead to a better future together, which I think is what many people want, but are not being given the choice right now because of the decisions made by Mr. Putin. So on that note, thank you so much on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, Pre-Russia Foundation, our partners, and Natalia, thank you to you and your colleagues too for helping us put this together. And we look forward to our next conversation. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.